Okay, welcome back. We are going to begin the afternoon here by giving Rick and David a chance to respond to the discussants' comments, and after that we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. So I'll begin with Rick.
Yeah, but we're just going to spend a couple of minutes because this is really the time for open discussion, and from not just the academics in the crowd. I thought all of those comments were constructive, some of them very provocative. I'm not going to make a point-by-point response to them. Let me pick up on one point, however, that Tanya made. And it's one that I found disturbing, and I think that Tanya meant it to be disturbing. And that is, and I'll put it in the form of the question, can you really do experimental research in a political context in which it is virtually unthinkable that a police officer is going to stop, frisk, and arrest a young white stockbroker for smoking marijuana coming out of his loft? If that were part of the design of the experiment, right, in that neighborhood? And the answer is, I certainly take the point that experiments are not done in vacuums and that there is a political context. Indeed, I think there are political reasons, small p political reasons, for why New York City hasn't done experiments all these years, right? But I do think that it is very possible and feasible, and frankly, not all that costly, since the city has to make changes to its stop, question, and frisk program, to make those changes in a much more systematic way that would enable the police department and other city officials, and indeed the New York City population, to say, here are the various things the police do. These things appear to work best or are most effective with respect to these sorts of activities, these sorts of crimes, and these appear to work better for these sorts of crimes. Now, I think that can be done even in a political context in which it's difficult for a young officer to arrest that young stockbroker for smoking marijuana outside his loft. And you raise I think the point was meant to be disturbing, and indeed it was, but I guess I should say, I hope that that kind of attitude doesn't stand in the way of making progress in terms of finding out what works in New York. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. David?
Yeah, I'm actually going to take the opportunity to talk to a few of the themes because I actually thought the comments were really interesting and raised, in my mind at least, sort of new questions or new issues. So let me just speak to a few of them, and maybe that'll be picked up in the discussion afterwards, which would be nice. Let me say that I thought Bob has always raised thoughtful comments about the underlying theory behind this, and so did Tom Tyler. But just as a comment about all of this, for example, when I did research in Seattle, in which I had the first longitudinal data set in which I was able to show the crime was highly concentrated at a consistent level over time in Seattle, I then said, oh my God, it's interesting because there are some places where the trends tend to go a lot down, and some places they tend to go a lot up. And I went to the police department and said, oh my God, I have all this crime data and all this other data turned out at a micro level. Do you have any data on police activity I could have? And they had no data. In other words, it's interesting that the police should collect all this data on crime and what criminals do and arrests and events, and it's bureaucratic in a way. They collect very little data on what they're doing. And maybe that's something I should know through consent decrees, what's going on in New York sometimes, is the beginning of databases and what the police are doing, because what the police are doing is really important. For Tanya's comments, I just want to say, first of all, that one problem of giving people slides early on, I just want to correct something. When I wrote the slide, I was writing from my experience in other cities, and I said there's very little crime that occurs on intersections. That's not true in New York, it turns out. It's still the case that the majority of crime occurs on street segments, 70 or more %, but it is the case in New York that not all the crime that recorded at least at the intersections is traffic. There's crime recorded at the intersection. Now, it's interesting because I was wondering, and I'm going to look for more from Tanya, of to what extent the historical context of New York makes that realistic, or to what extent, another possibility, that this is just data errors. In other words, that maybe they're not coding it well. David Greenberg raised this from discussions he'd had with Jeff Fagan. But I would like to say something about this race issue. First of all, about the experiments, if the police believe what they're doing is right, they should be willing to randomly allocate it across the city. We're not supposed to be carrying out strategies on black people or white people or Hispanics or Jews or Greeks or anybody else, or men or women, etc., unfairly. There's supposed to be a fair system. It's an important part of the distributive justice idea. And so at least, and I've done random allocation of police strategies in 5 or 6 cities, and other people have done this in many other cities. And then there's a problem, and the problem goes something like this. Smith told me before he left, he said, well, it used to be that in minority neighborhoods, the police didn't work. In other words, that to some degree there was a complaint about depolicing in minority neighborhoods. In other words, we don't get the service we deserve. Those rich people who don't need us, they get the service. Now, any forward-looking police commissioner, Gil Kurlikowski, told me when he was the police commissioner of Seattle, he says, what I do is I put a lot more resources in poorer neighborhoods, because those are the places when they need my resources most. Well, what's the outcome of that? More arrest of young people, more social control, et cetera, in poor neighborhoods. So I guess I was thinking as you were talking that maybe what communities need to do is demand not just more policing, but better policing. In other words, quite often policing can be lawful but awful, right? When you get more police, you often get more awful. What you want to do is change the way the police work, and that's an important part of Tom Tyler and other people, the work they've been doing, and in that way, make this increase in policing, if you like, a good thing. And that's what, by the way, Gil Kurlikowski believed, that he was investing his resources. If you want to know the mentality of the chief, he was investing his resources. He wasn't thinking of, he is a very kind of decent, liberal kind of guy. He thought he was doing good. And some of the outcomes of doing good can be bad. I don't want to go too much across this, but just Dolores, my work, and if you look at the paper we published in Justice Quarterly, there's a lot of the hotspots are in Manhattan. If you go into a neighborhood that you think the whole neighborhood is being hit, at least in terms of large hits, now there may be individual hits in other places, they are focused, there's a lot of street-by-street variability, just like there is in crime. That may lead to the same outcome, by the way, much higher rates of minorities being stopped. But there is a gigantic set of problems in the criminal justice system in American society generally that this is just a part of in terms of, and people have written about this for a long time, and it's hard to distinguish between fairness and other issues. Yeah, there were really good comments, and I'm not going to say more because then I'll feel bad with with Rick just talking a little bit. But let me just say one other thing about the model. So, yeah, this is a tough thing. I wrote an article that was published in the Journal of Experimental Criminology, my Joan McCord lecture, and in it, the whole article is about all these ideas somehow that you can ignore the problems of observational data are wrong, that it's very hard to come to causal conclusions. So I can't argue with you that it's hard to come to causal conclusions. However, I will say this. I don't understand why people find it so hard to recognize the fact or to be open to the fact that SQFs are deterrents. Let me give you an example. Saudi Arabia has a penalty for robberies and stuff like that, where you cut off a person's hand. I am certain, without an experiment, that probably has some sort of deterrent effect. I am not going to do that, irrespective. In this case, we have a large experimental literature on hotspots policing. We know the strategy is focused on hotspots. It has all the other elements of deterrence that you would expect. So why is it so difficult? I don't really understand this kickback of why it's so difficult to say. It's probably the case, there's not certainty, that SQFs have a deterrent effect in crime. And it's not that, by the way, the fixed effects modeling takes into account heterogeneity within places. You do the same place. The other approach we use was very descriptive. It doesn't prove, but it's sure interesting that pattern happens, right? So, yeah, I guess I just say that to me it seems that what we ought to be doing is saying there's reasonable evidence it should have been experimental, but there's reasonable evidence, especially based with other work, that this might have an effect on crime. We should be thinking about is, how can we have those sorts of effects on crime with strategies that are very, very different, and they don't have all those noxious elements to them. Anyway, but I appreciate the comments were really useful, and thank you very much.
Thank you, David. All right, so we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Jim. Jim, hold on. Behind you.
And Jim, they're both directed at Rick.
Well, actually, it's sort of at both of you guys, and maybe a little at Dan, who's an innocent bystander in this one. I think it's. Can you tell me, you've just invested a ton of time doing this research, and I'm very impressed with it. And I'm impressed also with what will come out of the data that you all have mobilized for this thing, because you're not done yet. But what would you have to have found for you not to have recommended RCTs? So what would you have to have found in these observational studies not to recommend RCTs?
What's an RCT?
Random control trial.
Well, I'm not certain any particular finding would have led me to not recommend conducting, let's just call it classic field experiments, right? Randomized controlled trials. I could take lots of different over-the-counter medications, right? One after another, and using the accumulated experience of those medications, I could draw certain conclusions about which were effective, which not. No matter what conclusion I drew, I'd still want, as the FDA requires, a randomized controlled trial performed on my medication, right? So I don't know, Jim, that any...
But you'll still make a judgment about your taking that medication based on the...
Yeah. There are, we divide into at least two populations. One population would argue they're relatively purist. If you cannot make strong causal claims typically based on randomized control experiments, then you had better not engage in the business of policy guidance, because you're only going to provide misinformation, misguidance. That's not my position. We live in an imperfect world. I always think of, as a now ex-smoker, I always think of, one of the massive social experiments, social interventions ever done was the intervention around smoking. There were not randomized controlled trials involving human beings that demonstrated that smoking caused cancer. There are certain issues that are very important, and we have to, in many cases, deal with observational data and try to model those data as best we can. But we have to be very, very careful not to forget that we're dealing with strong deficiencies in those data. Sometimes we can do nothing about that. But in this case, we know increasingly that we can do something about it. So, again, I would not have drawn any particular conclusion about randomized control trials depending on what we found from our own research. Had we found very strong crime reduction effects, very, very strong ones, I would definitely have wanted to do a randomized control trial because I would have suspected those. Had we found none at all, as we did in our first study, I'd want to do a randomized control trial because I might have suspected suppression effects in the observational data. Either way, I still think we need to do experiments in this area.
Yeah, I'd like to say something as well. I mean, it's a really good question. I'll tell you why, because experiments are costly in the sense of their intervention in the world. I mean, some people get something, other people don't. They're hard for political entities to carry out for all the reasons that some of the bad reasons Tanya made, but there are also good reasons in the sense of the provision of public services and all these kinds of issues. Let me just tell a story from my experience in New York. When New York started CompStat, CompStat in part developed out of work on the concentration of crime within geography, so I was obviously very interested. So I came to New York, and I was a lot younger, not just a bit younger. And I came with the president of the Police Foundation, and we had a meeting with the commissioner, who was not Bill Bratton, I'll say. And it was very intimidating for you New Yorkers, for those people from outside that don't live here anymore. You know, you come into that building, it's a skyscraper, you come upstairs, and outside the commissioner's office is Teddy Roosevelt's desk. I'm sure if you've been there. It's a little overwhelming. Then when you go in to meet him, you go through this corridor with these security people living in Israel a good part of the time. I'm actually assuming they're like x-raying me, they're doing something to see what's going on with me. And then you come in, this is New York, it's a big white room with 3 chairs in it, you know, totally stylish and intimidating. And anyway, so the chief is there, and I went through this bunny rabbit, you know, naive kind of thing, saying, you know, look, you don't know. I said, you're making all your statements, and I was right, it turned out, from prior work, the work came after. You're making all your statements on the basis of these general trends. I said, what you're doing is focusing in on small geographic areas. That's where you have to do a study. And I said, I've spoken to the people at the Department of Justice. They're very interested. It would be a very interesting study to do. And he turned to me and said, David, you can only bring me bad news. Okay, now, that's funny in a way, right? You can only bring me bad news because all the good news from Time Magazine and everything else is good. But it suggests the extent to which public policing has not sort of advanced in its thinking about the world. Because if I told you that story, we're talking about breast cancer, you would have a strong reaction, I suspect. Why would we want, and let's just take the following thing. When do you do experiments? You're exactly right. When do you have to do experiments? When do you do experiments? You don't do them in every situation. They're costly, they involve some people getting treatment, some not. They're hard to carry out, they involve interference. So when do you do them? Well, one statement would be when you're afraid there might be negative consequences. In other words, if a treatment could only produce positive effects, in some sense you say, I'll do it. Produce a little positive effect, produce a big positive effect. But what about treatments that produce potentially negative effects? I would argue that all police treatments produce possible negative effects. That's why it's so important in policing to do this. Stop, question, frisk can not only reduce crime, it could be decreasing legitimacy of individuals or the community. It could be creating long-term health problems. It could be, think of all the could-bes. And yet we allowed a public agency to bring that treatment 800,000 times in 1 year on the basis that you can only bring me bad news, which I'm sure is what they thought, because they know that there are better ways to do something. So what I'd say is, when would I not think an experiment was needed? Well, if the treatment was, from all the prior research, was so clear there were not negative impacts, okay, so don't do an experiment. You know, you're not going to pay much. When you have an evidence train that suggests that there's some efficiency, et cetera. I mean, all those things. But when you get into the territory of public agencies that can not only produce good, but produce bad, and that's, by the way, why the NIH now is so invested in the experimental approach, because they view any medication as possibly having a negative impact. It's not so much, you know, like you take all that stuff we all do, like for the airport, you get on the plane, you take that stuff in your mouth to try to make it so you won't get sick. It probably doesn't work. But, you know, there's no evidence it does any harm. So that's and here in New York City, I think that it's a public health disaster that we allow the police to have that kind of impact on our lives without demanding that they first experiment and tell us what that impact is.
There's a more positive spin on that, though, too. David, I think you just asked the question, or answered the question. If it's a question, you're only bringing me bad news. I mean, another way to approach not just the New York City Police Department, but any public agency for purposes of trying to open the eyes of officials to the benefits of research is that, take the police as an example, the police do a lot of different things. And police officers, police commanders, have gut feelings about what's effective with what sort of crime and what's less effective with another sort of crime. But these days in particular are willing to admit, well, that's just those are gut feelings. Experiments allow you to find out in a rather systematic way what works with what type of outcome. And so the outcomes may simply be null. You know, David, the outcomes are not necessarily positive or negative.
And then
the
you're wasting a lot of
be
public resources.
Exactly, positive or a waste of time and effort. Well, it's important to find out what's wasteful and what is not, where activities can be realigned, reoriented, and experiments help with that. So I don't know that you need to come out quite as strong as you did about all the disastrous consequences that could emerge. I quite agree with you. There are such consequences. I don't think that's the best sales pitch, though, to the local police chief.
I was talking to Jim, however. I'm very happy to see, when I started doing experimental work, it was not a lot of criminologists were doing it per se. And I'm very happy to see that so many people are being drawn into the experimental data world. You know?
Okay, we have Al, Tanya, and Marjorie.
I think the results we've seen today are absolutely fascinating and so much further ahead in where we are than we were 2 years ago when a lot of this work got started. So I think the results have been really fascinating. I think it's clear that experiments would be desired, but it's also clear that, as usual, the failure of a double-blind experiment is going to have lots of complications. The places with lower stop and frisk will be places with more other police activity, and so you're going to see lots of problems. You're going to see some rogue police officers in both of the areas, maybe some in where stop and frisk is greater. So you're going to see a lot of the problems that Tanya and Dolores raised. So I think it's going to be short of the definitive results that we're going to want, because many of the complications that have been raised to the issues that came up today are going to be there. I think the issue of legitimacy is particularly important, and I think it's important to get a sense of the legitimacy sense in the larger community. It's clear from some of the work that's been done, particularly by Vera, where they tested the sense of legitimacy by the young people, that there's a sense of legitimacy that's associated with the rest of the community, the older people, who may be delighted at whatever crime reduction they think is going on or is going on. And I suspect that delight was much greater in the 90s when there were high rates of crime, as opposed to the aughts when crime rates were way down, and so other considerations started to come in. So the issue of both the effectiveness of the experiments as well as the legitimacy issues are going to be complicating in all of the research that follows, and particularly the concerns by minority communities who are one way or another going to be primary targets of the stop and frisk and the erroneous stop and frisk.
Thanks, Al. Well, let's go to Tanya and then Marjorie, and then we'll go back to Dan.
Yeah, briefly, I just wanted to say to Rick that I probably should have been more nuanced in my comments. And it's not that I think that it's impossible to design, a control study that would, deploy stop and frisk or reforms of stop and frisk differentially so as to, measure them against a control group. And, I hope that will be possible in a more enlightened administration. But what I do think is that you cannot possibly replicate the intensity of stop and frisk in the way that it occurs in minority neighborhoods in white, more affluent neighborhoods. And I think that is just a political reality that we have to grapple with, because I think that a policy like stop and frisk, the way it is abused and overused in recent history in New York, is fundamentally dependent on the economic disempowerment of the people who it affects. And I think, for example, 12 years ago or so, I was at the Open Society Foundations, and we were supporting a lot of work around reform of driving while black, right? The highway style profiling. And, we were supporting some really fabulous advocates, but there was all of these questions about how do you benchmark it? What's the benchmark, right, for highway profiling? Very difficult to study, right? And it wasn't until elite blacks, right, the judges and the defense attorneys and ball players, right, or elite black folks were getting affected and stopped and, putting their stories in the media, that you saw a rapid turnaround, such that President Bush himself was saying, racial profiling is an abomination, we must do something about it. Then, of course, 9/11 hit and everything changed. But I would suggest that the longevity of the kind of pedestrian stops or abusive pedestrian stops that we see in poor neighborhoods is deeply, deeply intertwined with the poverty in those neighborhoods, right? And we just saw a much more, and of course there's been a successful campaign against it. I don't want to gainsay the fact that we are now seeing a process of reform, but that campaign against stop and frisk in New York was longer and harder than it was in the DWB highway profiling for a reason. And I think the reason is that in the highway profiling context, you had a broader swath, an socioeconomic array, right, swath of people who were affected.
Well, that's a wonderful point. Fortunately, though, we would never want to reproduce in an experimental setting abusive policing tactics, because under no circumstances would want to reinforce that kind of tactic. So the clarification was helpful.
Do you want us to respond? I find it hard when there are 3 questions, trying to remember what I'm saying. So maybe if we could stop here and then go on to the next question. Yeah, let me just say something about this, again, this idea of allocating police resources and what happens. I'm very sensitive to this issue of who you can treat a certain way. I'll tell you why. I have a student in Israel doing a paper on the Occupy Wall Street. They don't call it that in Israel, but it's a protest movement among the middle classes and students against the housing problems, which are very substantial in Israel in terms of cost of housing relative to income and things like that. And one of the things she's been finding is that one of the reasons why the legitimacy evaluations are so negative, in a way, is because these young elites, in a sense, who are going to college and all those kind of things, can't believe the police are treating them that way. Because they're probably being treated the way the police treat everybody all the time, but they're not used to being the subjects of that control. So clearly, I think your point has been borne out in so many different ways. But having said that, let me give you the following. In Sacramento, there was an experiment which identified streets that are hotspots. Now, in Seattle, for example, Sacramento, when you identify hotspot streets, you find that in the bad neighborhoods, most of the streets do not have crime. And in many of the good neighborhoods, you have very high crime streets. Some of the highest crime streets are built around malls and other places that have a lot of traffic, right? And so one of the things I think we need to do is to get away from this neighborhood idea. The neighborhood idea is only reinforcing bad policing in my regard. It's reinforcing the idea that this is a bad neighborhood, as if all the people in that neighborhood are bad in all the streets. In Seattle, the worst neighborhood in the city, if you saw in my book, The Criminology of Place, there's a color-coded map. All the green streets, no crime. It's all green, except for some specific places. And it seems to me that if we moved a little to recognizing this, we'd get away from these stereotypes. So there's a cost to abandoning the community idea a bit, because the community is important, especially in New York. But there's also a benefit in saying to the police, there are high crime hotspots all over the city. You need to use the same, or at least catered approaches that fit that place in the same way. That's what we're about, whether it's in the whitest neighborhood or the African-American neighborhood or whatever, in a general way. So just as a thought in terms of thinking about that. Al, you mentioned the problem of experiments. Yeah, one has to be careful. I also tell that Israeli hell joke when I talk about experiments. So any research is very hard, and experiments would have to be carried out very carefully. I think that can be done, but it means you need to do it seriously. You don't start out with this fantasy, I'm just going to randomly out, you need to start with all the things, all the base stuff that needs to be done. There needs to be important funding, so you do a lot of preparation. You need to make sure you're not reinforcing negative things going on more generally in policing. So all those things take time and effort. I mean, what I took your comments to mean is not do experiments. But recognize you do experiments, you have to pay a lot of attention. And unlike observational research, for the last month, Elise Woodage has not gone home once. No, that's not true. But she's been in the lab an awful lot. But an experiment, that kind of activity comes before in terms of designing what you're doing.
Marguerite?
These have been wonderful papers. I've really enjoyed it. It has me thinking about 2 things in in some of the stuff that I've been looking at, which is the systemic effects of this. So Nancy Rodriguez and I have just done some work in Arizona on disproportionate minority contact in the juvenile justice system. And I think that if we were doing that in New York, we would say that one of the factors that was resulting in the disproportionate minority contact would be this policy, that the policy would have is having systemic effects that differ by group. And I'm also doing work right now on immigration policy, and one of the things that we're seeing there is that if you can be a permanent legal resident and be picked up for something, just stop by the police and they run a check on you and they see that you had what may have been a pretty minor offense, marijuana offense 20 years earlier, that now because of the 1999 laws has been defined as an aggravated felony, and you're deported. So that the effects of this style of policing are going to differ depending upon which population it is that you are engaged, that you're using it with. And I think that that's something that we have to think about, is that unlike in an experimental situation where maybe we'd say, okay, what are the effects going to be? Are they going to be the same for everyone? Here we know that there are differentiated effects depending upon, are you Latino and undocumented or legal resident? Are you a young person? I mean, we're seeing, I'm not saying anything different than what's been said, but I guess just reinforcing some of the ways in which it plays out differentially depending upon race and gender, that I think go even beyond these examples.
And I think Al should respond to that in a way, because remember, Al did work on the prison population and what led to the prison this work is very complicated because, I was at Yale Law School once, and there was a lecture on the death penalty, and, saying it's a problem and this and that. So one of the professors, and it said it was a problem because there are more blacks being sentenced to death, and one guy got up and said, let's sentence more whites to death. So, or do you want if you want everything to be racialized in that sense, do you want to change the whole structure so that certain types of arrests are made in white communities but not in black? I mean, you can imagine the problems that you run into in trying to think this through completely, And distributive justice could still lead to inequitable outcomes, which is one of the problems. In other words, if the police were being fair, they're going across everywhere and stuff, it could still lead to different outcomes because this society is not equal on many, many other things that have nothing to do with the criminal justice system.
Dan?
Yeah, I want to return to every discussant raised the issue of talking about stop and frisk is compared to what? I mean, when we ask the question, is stop and frisk effective? I think it's always important to ask compared to what. Now, I'll make an observation that I think that's really relevant to both of your studies and the interpretation of them. Is because as Bob Apel pointed out, you don't have the alternative things that the police were doing in your studies, and therefore it's hard to know how to interpret what these estimates mean because we don't have something in comparison to what, and therefore that has important implications for your calculations you do about the crimes averted. But you understand that. I want to bring this back to the experiments. If we're going to do experiments on, let me just call this generically proactive policing for lack, I don't know whether that's a very good label. But if David pointed out, if you're going to do an experiment, you have to define the treatment and the control condition. And what should they be if you're going to do this experiment? If it's going to be an experiment about stop and frisk, I'm not even sure we should necessarily do this experiment because it's so obnoxious. But even if we are going to do this experiment, should it mean that the officers only arrest when they find a weapon, or what they shouldn't arrest if they find drugs? And then importantly, what's the alternative treatment? I mean, they're going to do something. And what's that alternative going to be? And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
That's an interesting point. David made the point earlier that when it comes to experiments, as opposed to observational research, where so much of the work is in the analysis, and doing experiments, I've learned, it is much more front-loaded. So we did, working with the St. Louis Police Department, we did a randomized control field experiment. And Dan, to answer your question, you get at how to design you get at how to devise the experimental design by thinking very clearly about what it is you want to learn. In that case, we had one major objective. We wanted to know whether the presence of the police alone for 10 to 15 minutes, 3 times per shift, which is what the literature suggests is an appropriate dose, the degree to which that was associated with crime reduction. Okay? We also, however, wanted to know whether when the police engage in all the other things they do, checking buildings, checking vehicles, stopping pedestrians, and all of that, whether there was an additional crime reduction bonus associated with those activities over and above presence alone. But I think the essential issue was how much crime can be averted simply by enhancing police presence, but nothing else. So what we did, we devised with the various district captains, we devised an experiment in which it turns out within each district, we randomly allocated some hot spots to a condition in which directed patrols would be enhanced. And the directive in that condition was do not engage in other activity. Now, we can't stop the police from doing police work, just because there's an experiment going on. But in fact, we found that there was much less so-called self-initiated activity in that condition. The other condition was enhanced patrol plus enhanced self-initiated activity. The control is in effect, the single blind. It's not double blind. The control is do what you always do, some combination. That was the control. Now, what you cannot do, and this gets to Al's point, these are not the purest of pure experiments. You cannot depolice an area and have that be the control. You cannot do it. It seems to me the control necessarily is ordinary policing, and then what you're doing is systematically augmenting that in one way or another. In any event, that's how we did it. My sense is that's a fairly standard approach. David may have good ideas about even more innovative ones.